Hi students, this is going to be really quick as we get through the information that I want you to go through on really probably just one slide. This information right here on this slide is going to come in later parts of the period, so I'm not really going to go through it a lot. The Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893 are two things that we're going to actually kind of touch on today as we talk about some of the labor management. If you have this out, we're going to be looking really at labor management today. We'll talk more about Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, about Horatio Alger, and those things to come. So this is kind of an interesting slide that you can look at, understand that immigration now started to shift from Northern and Western Europe to more Southern and Eastern Europe. Chinese immigration also is becoming important at this time. Okay, so here we go. Labor and management battled over wages and working conditions. Now we're talking late 1800s here, with local workers organizing local and national unions and or directly confronting business leaders. What I want you to realize is after the Civil War, as production increases and the need for more and more workers in factory type jobs becomes important, we realize that there were issues such as labor conditions, working hours, pay, gender equality, that were a lot of issues that weren't necessarily being addressed. And one of the groups that really wanted to address especially those social issues were called the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor tended to be very anarchical. They relied on anarchy and chaos and rioting. A lot of violence happened, and so they didn't make a lot of headway as far as social changes coming in the workplace. There's a big issue happening in 1886 with what's called the Haymarket Square. I'm actually just going to play this right now for you because it's only like a minute and a half long. So I'll share my screen and we'll go through that.
Things you should never mix with water. Mascara. Home electronics. Chiz.
Hi, I'm Uhuru Williams. I'm a historian. And here's what you need to know in order to sound smart about the Haymarket Square Riot. The Haymarket Square Riot of 1886 had its origins in labor unrest that extended back to the decades after the Civil War. American laborers were particularly concerned about issues including the length of the workday and working conditions. The American labor movement at that time was also being influenced by more radical voices. Many of these individuals believed that not only should working conditions be improved, but that the entire capitalistic enterprise be smashed. On May 3rd, 1886, several workers were killed by police in a showdown at the McCormick Reaper plant in Chicago. Labor organizers called for a mass meeting and rally the following night at Haymarket Square. After one speaker, Samuel Felden, made a particularly inflammatory statement, police moved in to shut down the rally. As they were moving toward the stage, however, an unknown person tossed a bomb in their midst. In the ensuing violence, 7 police officers were killed and as many as 5 civilians wounded. In the absence of any real suspects, authorities turned their attention to the more radical influences in the labor movement. Despite the lack of any tangible evidence, 8 men were eventually arrested and put on trial. All 8 were convicted. In the end, 4 of those convicted were executed on November 11, 1887. Of the 3 remaining who had been convicted, 1 committed suicide, and the other 2 were ultimately pardoned by the governor of Illinois due to a public backlash against the unfair way in which the defendants had been treated. The 4 men who were executed in 1887 became international symbols of the struggle between capital and labor and the fight to ensure fair labor practices for all workers. Young people in large numbers came out.
Okay, so I think hopefully you get the idea that this became a real hot button topic, and the Haymarket Square Riot was a really important part to really set the tone of how how big business was managed. Now, as we talked about Andrew Carnegie, he's going to come up again when we talk about the Homestead strike, but Andrew Carnegie seemed to be always on the side of labor and workers. However, there was a new group that kind of came along, and let me move this down just a little bit. It was called the American Federation of Labor. In fact, the AFL, as it's called today, is still in existence today. Whereas the Knights of Labor really couldn't kind of make things happen because of their violence and their tendency for, like anarchy. The American Federation of Labor, and their founder is that man right there on the top. His name is Samuel Gompers. Might not hurt. I put the AFL chairman, Samuel Gompers. The American Federation of Labor definitely focused less on the social aspect of labor, less about equality, less about the kind of just laws, and more about the economics. So they were pushing more for better wages and things like that, and they weren't nearly as violent. And so the American Federation of Labor is still around today. In fact, if you've ever heard of the AFL-CIO, that's it. That's where they get their roots from in 1886. Bread and butter unionism is this idea that you could kind of shift away from the idea of the social issues and make it more about working conditions and minimum wage and things like that, in order the bread and butter issues. Because in all reality, people are, if they're paid well, they're probably more likely to continue to do their job. And it was called bread and butter unionism. Yellow dog contracts are, if you know what a yellow dog is, yellow dog contracts were basically employers were getting their employees to sign a contract when they were hired to guarantee or to promise that they would never join a union. Completely illegal. You definitely can't do it today. At that time, you probably shouldn't have been doing it then, but it was kind of you might have been looked at or called a yellow dog because you were kind of wimping out and you were not going to stand up to those big industrialists who wanted it their way or no way. Blacklists were basically lists of employees that went around between like business owners, of people who couldn't be hired because they couldn't be trusted because they were part of a union. Again, not something, you can't not be hired because you are part of a union, but this was happening. You were blacklisted. All right, the railway strike of 1877. Now, this has a lot to do with, if you looked on that slide before, the Panic of 1873. So in 1877, wages are going down significantly, and there is a lot of inflation that's happening. Inflation is kind of skyrocketing, actually. And so the railway strike was essentially, railroads started cutting costs and including wages, and so a lot of workers went on strike. Well, this caused a huge kind of ripple effect in the economy, but it was stemming from what had happened with this panic, this economic downturn in 1873, which also had a lot to do with railroad speculation. Now here we go, the Homestead Strike of 1892. So between the Haymarket Square, the Homestead Strike, and the Pullman Strike, these are really the three that I definitely want you to know from this slide. The Homestead Strike has all to do with Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel Company. Now remember, Andrew Carnegie is like the big guy, right? But essentially he's the one in charge. Well, he has a guy who's running his company named Frick, Henry Clay Frick. And essentially he gives Frick the go-ahead. And, I guess Carnegie is going to really get a tarnished reputation because of it. So here's what I want you to do. There's going to be a document, and I'm not going to pull it up just yet, but there's going to be a document of showing what has happened at the Homestead Strike. And I want you to really look at the names and examine that document, really kind of spy that document in detail. So the Homestead Strike is in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And essentially it's it's all about workers' wages and the number of hours that they're going to pay them. Let's see. Yeah, it's at the Carnegie plant. I don't have Carnegie Steel versus Iron Steel workers. Okay, so let me just kind of give you the breakdown. Frick, the guy who's under Carnegie, and this is with Carnegie's, best wishes, is going to hire what's called the Pinkerton men, or sometimes they're just called the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons are a detective agency, and they kind of came in as a security force because Frick knew that when he was going to start cutting wages, this was going to cause a really negative effect at this huge U.S. steel plant in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Well, he kind of preps beforehand for this to happen, and he cuts wages, and it gets to be really bad. The Pinkerton men, even in Pinkerton, it was originally like a detective agency. Pinkerton is still a security agency. If you've ever heard of Securitas, they are the original Pinkertons. The Pinkerton men were hired as like a security force to come in. Sometimes they were even hired as like spies, so they'd pretend they were workers and find out who was like drumming up problems, or who was joining a union, or whatever it happened to be. Well, there's a clash. Once wages are cut, and Frick cuts wages, the homesteaders are going to strike. Now, the homesteaders we're talking several thousand, like thousands of workers who are really angry about what has happened. And now this is all part of this economic downturn that's happening in 1893. And the homestead strike is really kind of what sets it all off. And the Pinkerton men and the homesteaders, what they're called the homesteaders, the people who worked at Carnegie Steel, get into a fight, and it's a deadly clash. It really is. And you can see some of the homesteaders died, some of the homestead folks, the U.S. Steel folks, some of the Pinkerton men died, and it becomes a really violent. In fact, it becomes so bad. I think I put that on here. The National Guard. I did put it on here. The National Guard has to come in and basically end the strike because the Pinkerton men were completely outnumbered. There were like 300 Pinkerton men, and there were way more workers than that, and the strike got really violent. It got really bad. People are dying, and eventually the National Guard has to come in. This is where kind of now Andrew Carnegie has a tarnished reputation. Before, he seemed to be all about helping the worker. He would always seem to be on the worker's side. And when he gave his blessings to do whatever Frick needed to do, he maybe was looked at differently than he had before. All right, and finally, the Pullman strike of 1894. Here's the cartoon. I want to kind of go through this with you. Pullman was a large entrepreneur in Chicago, and he had, in fact, in the south part of Chicago, they were called like Pullman City. Like, in fact, even Carnegie had some of the same things, where you would essentially build homes for your workers to live in, and so they would have been really close to the factory. Well, the Pullman strike, and again, this is after the Panic of 1893, the Pullman strike is happening in 1894 because Pullman, again, he's providing areas or like housing for his workers to live in, but he's cutting wages. In fact, he lays off a whole bunch of employees, but he's actually increasing their rent on these homes that they live in. However, sometimes they would be in a contract where they couldn't even move, but it was actually so convenient for them. So it becomes a huge deal. And by the way, Pullman, they made railway cars. Do you know what a Pullman car is? It's a sleeper car where on a train, a train car, you would take long journeys, long travels, and you could sleep on there. Well, that's what they developed. They made Pullman cars. And so all of these workers were building train cars, Pullman cars. And you can see him kind of just twisting there. He's twisting every last dime out of that man. And so again, this is really very much kind of contributing to, what do I have? Contributing to this depression. He cut wages, increased hours. Oh, one thing that I want you to add, in the Pullman strike, it got so bad that Grover Cleveland was the president at this time. The president had to step in and kind of settle and like have a negotiation to end the strike, because Pullman cars actually also carried mail, and so it was disrupting the United States mail and the postal service. And so the president actually stepped in this case and settled the strike in Pullman, Illinois. So this is a really, you should have on this sheet, you should have something about the Haymarket riot, which is really about the 8-hour workday. You should have a little bit of something about the AFL. You should have something about the Homestead strike. And really the Homestead strike is probably one of the most pivotal events in U.S. labor history. I mean, this is really kind of what's setting off other ideas of labor unions and striking. And then something on the Pullman strike. All right, so that's it for today. We are done with that. Talk to you later. Bye.